In the fall of 1919, on the high plains of Wyoming, people began to notice Silas Thorne doing something strange. He was digging a trench, not for irrigation or a house foundation. It was a long, deep ditch running from the north wall of his small cabin to the south wall of his barn, about 40 feet apart. Neighbors riding along the county road would slow their horses. They watched Silas, a man not yet 30, working with steady, quiet rhythm. He shoveled dirt, stacked stones, then built a low but wide roof over the trench. People thought he had gone mad. They called it Thorne's Folly. Some mocked it as the coward's hallway. At the general store, most figured the newcomer, a World War I veteran, simply feared snow. They said he was building a tunnel so he wouldn't have to step outside in blizzards to feed his livestock. But when the winter of 1919 arrived, a brutal, record-breaking cold that stretched on endlessly, that crazy tunnel became the line between survival and surrender. If you want to know the number that silenced the best builders in the county, stick around to the end. What did this quiet man from elsewhere understand about wind and heat that every seasoned rancher in the valley missed? If you like forgotten stories of ingenuity like this, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Silas Thorne had no intention of starting any revolution. He was just a 28-year-old former combat engineer trying to keep his family from freezing to death. He had come to Wyoming with his wife Eleanor and 2 young daughters, seeking peace and space after long days in the trenches of France. His previous trade wasn't building log cabins. It was constructing bunkers, dugouts, and trenches that could withstand not only enemy fire, but also the harsh European winters. He understood soil, pressure, and above all, the physics of cold. Their cabin was built solidly in the traditional way, logs chinked tight, with a stone fireplace and a loft for the girls. By frontier standards, it was a fine house. But their first winter there, the winter of 1918, taught them a brutal lesson. Wyoming wind is a visible force, a relentless thief of heat. It didn't just blow around the house, it clawed at it. Silas burned through 7 large cords of wood, an enormous amount for such a small home. Every night he woke every 3 hours to feed the fire. Even so, the indoor temperature rarely climbed above 50 degrees. Misery showed in every small detail. His 5- and 7-year-old daughters slept in coats and wool caps, huddled under piles of heavy blankets. Every evening his wife stuffed rags along the baseboards, only to find them frozen solid by morning. Condensation on the walls froze into thick frost on the inside. The water bucket in the corner often turned into a solid block of ice by dawn. They survived, but only just. There was no comfort, only shivering endurance and gloom. Throughout that long winter, Silas didn't just feel the cold, he studied it. He watched how snow piled against the east and west walls, while the north side stayed almost bare, scoured by wind. The prevailing wind came from the north, roaring unchecked across miles of open prairie. It hammered the cabin's north wall day and night like a sledge. That was when the idea came, echoing something he had learned in the army. Wind doesn't just cool the air. It strips heat directly from walls through a process called convective heat loss. A wall losing heat to still air at 0 degrees is one thing, but when that same temperature comes with 30 mile-an-hour wind slamming against it, heat is carried away 20 times faster. One night, he told Eleanor in a low voice, "We're not really fighting the temperature. We're fighting the wind. The house is like a man standing in a gale without a coat. No matter how warm he is inside, the wind pulls the heat out of his body." His plan formed slowly, then crystallized. He couldn't move the cabin. He couldn't stop the wind, but he could put a coat on the house. He could build a massive windbreak. His barn sat 40 feet north of the cabin, right in the path of the prevailing wind. What if the cabin and barn were no longer separate structures? What if they became one continuous form? His idea was simple in concept. He would connect them with an enclosed, earth-sheltered passageway. The structure would do 3 things. First, it would block wind from hitting the cabin's most vulnerable wall. Second, the still air inside the corridor would act as a buffer, an insulating layer of dead air. Third, the barn itself, a large mass holding latent heat from animals and hay, would become a giant windbreak against the northern cold. Opportunity came late in the summer when a military surplus sale at an old army post offered stacks of rough-cut lumber and corrugated metal sheets at an unexpectedly low price. Silas spent $60 and hauled it all back to his ranch. The next day, the digging began, and the neighbors started to notice. The materials were cheap, scavenged out of necessity. Surplus army lumber and metal formed the main frame. For the foundation, he used stones gathered from his own land, mortared with a clay and sand mix. The construction proceeded like a series of deliberate, logical steps. He dug a 4-foot-deep trench below the frost line. He laid 6 inches of coarse gravel for drainage, a lesson from the waterlogged trenches of France. On top of that, he built low 2-foot stone retaining walls as a base. Then he framed the walls and low-sloping roof with the army surplus wood. The structure stretched 40 feet long and 10 feet wide. From the outside, it looked like a crude, low roof hugging the ground. But the real genius wasn't in what could be seen. The storyteller might say, here's what made it truly brilliant. Silas didn't just make a covered walkway. He created an earth-bermed corridor. All the dirt excavated from the trench was piled against the east and west walls of the new structure, right up to the eaves. He tamped it down and sealed it over. This technique, called earth-berm insulation, harnessed the massive thermal mass of the soil as protection. Frozen ground changes temperature slowly and thaws slowly. By burying the corridor's walls, he made them nearly immune to the sudden, violent cold snaps of the high plains. The earth itself became his insulation. One evening, he carefully explained the physics to Eleanor, not lecturing but confirming his own thinking. Still, air holds heat, he said, sketching on a scrap of wood. Moving air steals it. That's the whole principle. This corridor traps a 40-foot-long bubble of still air on the north side of our house. It's like the dead air space in double-pane glass, but on a much larger scale. Wind can slam this new wall, but it will never reach the cabin. He paid special attention to moisture, the most common failure point in such structures. He roofed it with corrugated metal sheets, but before laying them, he installed wide overlapping layers of roofing felt. Where the new roof met the cabin and barn, he fashioned custom tin flashing from scrap sheet metal to ensure watertight joints. He cut 2 small louvered vents high on the east and west corridor walls to allow adjustable airflow and prevent vapor buildup in warmer months. From the outside, the finished result looked decidedly odd. It resembled a long green hill rising between the cabin and barn. The house that once stood alone on the prairie now appeared anchored to the ground, hunkered down, as if the barn had swallowed it. The only visible parts of the connector were 2 low, dark door openings at each end and the dull gleam of the tin roof. Total cost, recorded in his ledger, came to less than $120, $75 for surplus materials, $30 for extra lumber from the local sawmill, and about $10 for nails, fittings, and roofing tar. Eleanor stood beside him, looking at their strange new home shape. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the autumn air was still pleasant. "Silas," she said softly, almost a whisper, "people are going to think we've lost our minds." Silas didn't look at her. He gazed toward the northern horizon where the sky had turned a pale, cold blue. "Let them think that," he replied. And when the neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering or calculation. They saw fear. They thought it was a man so terrified of winter that he had dug himself a burrow. The mockery began even before the first snow fell. The first visitor was Calvin Dreyer. Dreyer ran the sawmill and had framed nearly half the cabins in the valley, including Silas's original structure. He was a man whose word carried weight. He walked around the project, kicking the bermed earth with his boot. He squinted at the roofline. Finally, he shook his head, his face showing professional pity. "Thorne," he said without malice, "I don't know what they taught you in the army, but this isn't going to work." He pointed a thick finger at where the new roof met the cabin's log wall. "You've just created a moisture trap. Snow will pile up in that corner," he went on. "Then it'll melt, soak into the wood, and in 2 years that north wall will be rotten. You'll have mushrooms growing in your bedroom." He kicked the berm again. "And this dirt piled right against the wood like that? You're just inviting rot and bugs. Come spring, this thing will be a heap of ruin." Silas listened calmly, hands in his pockets. His reply was slow and even. "I've accounted for drainage, Calvin." "It's not drainage," Dreyer insisted. "It's air. Wood needs to breathe." "You've buried your house alive." Silas only nodded. "We'll see." Dreyer left, shaking his head, and by evening the story had spread across the valley. It was Calvin Dreyer who declared Thorne's Folly a disaster waiting to happen. Public humiliation came a week later at the general store. Silas went in for salt and coffee. Hank Miller, a loud rancher proud of his toughness, saw him enter. In a voice loud enough for the whole store to hear, he laughed. "Well, look who crawled out of his hole. Silas, you finished that coward's hallway yet? Better stock up on extra grain for winter." A few men chuckled awkwardly. Silas didn't react. He paid and walked out, laughter trailing him to the street. The name stuck. To many, he was now just the gopher. The gossip network buzzed. At church socials, women asked Eleanor in mock sympathy if she felt claustrophobic. At quilting bees, conversations halted when she entered, replaced by forced smiles and pitying looks. Men riding past their ranch would rein in just to stare at the odd low mound, pointing and murmuring. It became a local curiosity, a monument to what they believed was one man's foolishness. Eleanor felt the pressure most keenly. "They think you're afraid, Silas," she told him one night, voice tight. "They think the war made you timid. Hank Miller's telling everyone you can't face a little snow." But the deepest cut came from her own brother Thomas, who rode over one Sunday. A practical man, a rancher who respected tradition because it had proven itself. He stood with Silas, looking at the connector. His criticism came as concern. "Silas," he began, searching for words. "I worry for you, for your standing. People are talking. They'll think you're either scared or incompetent. Maybe both. Out here, a man's reputation is all he's got. You're making yourself a laughingstock." Silas finally turned to look at him. Expression unreadable. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," he said, voice calm and certain. "I'm just trying to keep my family warm." By October, as the first hard freezes bit the air, no one in the valley believed Silas Thorne had solved anything. They thought he had erected a monument to his own peculiar anxieties, a 4-0 foot testament to failure. Keep watching, because what happened next didn't just prove Silas right, it changed how the valley thought about survival. Then November arrived, bringing cold sharp enough to separate theory from reality. The winter of 1919 is still recorded in Wyoming's climate logs as one of the harshest of the 20th century. It didn't creep in. It struck like a blade. Temperatures dropped relentlessly and cruelly, like a drumbeat of worsening numbers. On December 8, the thermometer at the general store read -8 degrees Fahrenheit at night. By December 12, it fell to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. And by December 18, the mercury froze solid at the bottom of the tube at -38 degrees Fahrenheit. At the same time, the wind began howling from the north, driving wind chills to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind and snow didn't drift gently. They attacked, driven by a relentless force that eroded even the will to endure. Snow packed into concrete hard drifts. For 23 consecutive days, the valley thermometer never rose above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The community began to buckle under the pressure. This wasn't an ordinary hard winter. It was a siege. Suffering spread and showed everywhere. The long-established Colby Ranch burned 2 cords of seasoned hardwood a month and still only held the main house around 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The manager's children coughed with persistent dry hacks. Thomas, Silas's brother-in-law, admitted his family burned half a cord a week just to stay above freezing, and his wife cooked snow on the stove for drinking water because the well pump had frozen solid. Failures appeared across the valley. Families burning green or wet wood saw weak, smoky fires that filled cabins with acrid smell while giving off little heat. Moisture in the wood had to be boiled off before the log itself could burn, a disastrous waste of energy. Some cabins even had chimney fires when desperate families built roaring blazes, igniting built-up creosote. Livestock began dying. Many cattle were found frozen, standing in makeshift shelters. Chickens froze on their roosts. People started burning furniture, fence posts, anything that would ignite. Dignity was the first casualty, hope the next. Then people started noticing the Thorne place. At first it was small details. Smoke from Silas's chimney looked different. It was thin and slow, a pale gray wisp drifting lazily, not the thick, desperate black plumes pouring from every other stack in the valley. It showed a slow, steady fire, not a ravenous blaze consuming everything. Then a neighbor riding past during a brief lull in the wind saw Silas walk from barn to cabin. He wasn't even wearing a heavy coat, just a short-sleeved shirt. The neighbor thought he must have lost his mind or the cold had finally broken him. The man rode on and told the story at the store as further proof of Thorne's strangeness. But the image lingered in people's minds. A man in shirt sleeves during the worst freeze in a generation. No one could figure out what was happening. That gopher hole still sat there, a long, snow-covered mound. Yet inside that cabin, something seemed to be happening that ran completely counter to every experience and logic. Keep watching. Because the numbers coming out of that house didn't just stun the valley, they rewrote the rules. The breaking point came on December 23. Temperature at minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit, wind sharp as broken glass. Calvin Dreyer, the sawmill owner, was making emergency runs, hauling wood to families he knew were in danger. He felt a heavy responsibility. On his list was the Thorne place. He was certain that young family, with their foolish ideas, must be on the brink of disaster. He loaded a quarter quart of his best seasoned oak onto his sled as a gift and set out. He expected to find a family huddled under blankets, a smoky cabin, and a man finally ready to admit he was wrong. When he stopped, the wind tore so hard it nearly ripped the reins from his frost-numbed hands. He steadied himself and pounded on the cabin door. The door opened almost immediately. It was Eleanor Thorne. The first thing that stunned him wasn't the sight, but the sensation. Warmth. It poured from the doorway, hitting him like stepping into another season. A steady, dry, comfortable wave of heat. He was so shocked he couldn't speak for several seconds. Behind her, through the cabin doorway, Dreyer saw something that dissolved every doubt in an instant. The two Thorne girls were sitting at the kitchen table drawing on sheets of paper. They wore simple cotton dresses, no coats, no wrapped blankets, just ordinary dresses. Eleanor saw the astonishment on his face and the pile of wood on the sled. "Calvin," she said calmly, "is everything all right?" He stammered, I brought you some wood. I was worried about your family." "That's kind of you," she replied, and for the first time Dreyer saw not a timid newcomer but a woman of quiet, deep strength. "But we're managing fine. Come in out of the wind." He stepped inside. The air was pleasantly even, no smoke, no drafts. The girls looked up, greeted him, then bent back to their drawings. Silas came through the inner door from the corridor, carrying a bucket of milk. He was still in shirt sleeves. He nodded to Dreyer. Finally, Calvin Dreyer found his voice. "How are you doing this?" he asked, gesturing around the unbelievably warm room. "What kind of wood are you burning?" "Just pine and cottonwood," Silas answered. "What's on the place?" "We burn less than a cord every 2 weeks." The words hung in the air. Dreyer did the mental math instantly. Less than a cord every 2 weeks under half a cord a month, while others burned half a cord a week and still froze. It was almost impossible. His eyes swept the room, searching for a trick or secret. They finally stopped on the old mercury thermometer hanging by the window. He walked over, boots thumping on the wood floor. He squinted. The mercury stood unmistakably at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. That unthinkable number stared back. 68 degrees while outside it was 35 below, a difference of 103 degrees. Pause for a second to feel that. 103 degrees. Dreyer still had families on his wood delivery list who would celebrate if their indoor temperature hit 40 degrees. He reached out his still stiff cold hand and touched the north wall, the very wall he had once declared would surely ice over and rot. It was cool to the touch but bone dry. No trace of frost, no hint of draft. He turned to Silas, his lifetime of professional certainty and experience crumbling in the face of this simple, warm room. "My house is only 45 degrees, he said, voice full of disbelief. "I'm burning seasoned oak. 2 cords a month." Silas gave a small nod and motioned for Dreyer to follow. He led him to the corridor door. When it opened, the air in the long passage was colder but utterly still. No wind at all. It felt like stepping into a cave. The loudest sound was their own breathing. "The wind never reaches the house," Silas said simply. That's the whole secret. We're not heating the whole valley, just the cabin. When the numbers were placed side by side, the difference was staggering. The Colby Ranch burned 2 cords of hardwood a month to hold 42 degrees. Thomas's cabin needed nearly 2 cords of mixed wood a month for 48 degrees. Calvin Dreyer's own solid house required 2 cords of prime oak to maintain 45 degrees. Silas Thorne's cabin used 3/4 of a cord of low-grade pine a month and held a comfortable 68 degrees. The difference wasn't just a little better. It was fundamentally different. It wasn't doing the same thing more efficiently, it was doing something else entirely. Dreyer stood there a long time, the quiet warmth of the house in total contrast to the howling wind outside. He looked at the children, comfortable and safe. He looked at the small, steady fire in the hearth. Then he looked at the man he had once pitied and ridiculed. Finally, he turned to Silas, his face marked by a new, profound understanding. He spoke one short sentence that changed everything. "We've been doing it wrong for 70 years. And it wasn't just about warmth. It was about dignity. Children could do lessons without shivering. Eleanor could cook in just an apron instead of a heavy coat. The whole family slept through the night without waking repeatedly to feed a greedy fire. The system had turned winter from something to be barely survived into something that could actually be lived in." A week later, the county agricultural agent, Mr. Davies, arrived. He had heard unbelievable rumors from Dreyer and wanted to see for himself. He brought a calibrated thermometer and an anemometer to record wind speed. Davies was an institutional skeptic, a man of science and government technical bulletins. He measured inside the cabin, 67 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Then he recorded wind speed. In the open, gusts hit 40 miles per hour. But when he placed the anemometer in the 10-foot wide space between the cabin's north wall and the corridor's south wall, the cups barely turned. The reading was just 3 miles per hour, a 92% reduction in wind speed. Davies worked meticulously. He discovered Silas kept an extremely detailed logbook. Every day, he recorded outdoor temperature, indoor temperature, and exact wood consumption. This wasn't luck. It was data. It was engineering. The news spread through the valley like slow-melting ice. It was no longer rumor. It was fact. When the terrible freeze ended in mid-January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening at the Thorne place. Mockery vanished, replaced by stunned, reluctant respect. The first to change his mind was Silas's brother-in-law, Thomas. His family had suffered all winter. The woodpile was nearly gone, and his pride had frozen along with it. One February day he appeared at the door, hat in hand. He didn't apologize, men like him rarely did. He just said, "Silas, show me how it works." Silas spent the whole afternoon with him, sketching the design, explaining the principle of still air and the earth-berm insulation. That spring, Thomas didn't build an exact duplicate tunnel. He built a simpler version, a tall, solid windbreak wall 10 feet deep, set 40 feet north of his cabin to create a dead air space. It wasn't as effective as Silas's enclosed, bermed corridor. But the next winter, his wood consumption dropped 40%. It really worked. The principle was sound and adaptable. Adoption of the original idea was slow at first, then sudden. By that summer, 7 families had built their own versions of the Thorne wall. Some put up simple, tall fences. Others built more ambitious, covered shelters for storage. By the following winter, 19 cabins in the valley had some form of northern wind barrier, and regional wood consumption dropped noticeably for the first time on record. People no longer called it Thorne's Folly. They began calling it the Wyoming Wall or Thorne Design. Mr. Davies, the agricultural agent, became the official chronicler. In the fall of 1920, he published a bulletin titled "Innovative Methods to Reduce Convective Heat Loss on High Plains Ranches." It was full of Silas's data, Davies's measurements, and diagrams of the original structure. Though dry and technical, the document spread through agricultural offices in Wyoming, Montana, and the Dakotas. Within a decade, many variants of earth-bermed wind walls appeared in new construction across the northern plains, often built by carpenters who had never heard the name Silas Thorne. What Silas built in 1919 anticipated by nearly half a century what later building scientists would call an integrated thermal envelope for structures. He wasn't an inventor. He was an adapter. He took a principle learned in one harsh environment, military fieldworks, and applied it to another harsh environment. Years later, when a young reporter from Cheyenne came to interview the quiet man, whose simple idea had made life much more bearable for so many, he asked Silas if he felt proud of his invention. Silas, now a silver-haired grandfather, calm as ever, just shook his head slightly. He looked out over the windy prairie. "There's nothing new about it," he said. "It's just right. The earth knows how to hold heat. The wind knows how to steal it. I just paid attention." The original cabin and barn still stand there, joined by the long grass-covered mound of the corridor. It has outlasted many newer, more modern buildings, a quiet testament to a simple truth. The frontier doesn't reward stubbornness or tradition for its own sake. It rewards what actually works. It rewards the quiet observer, the humble engineer who understands you can't fight a force like Wyoming wind head-on. The wise thing is to step aside and let it pass. Leave a comment. Where are you watching from? And when was the coldest winter you ever experienced? Subscribe to the channel to discover more proven frontier survival techniques every week. This video dramatizes historical frontier engineering methods inspired by real history. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, but the techniques described are based on actual historical practices and building science principles.